Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Darren Shan reread video. This one is going to be for book 10, which is called The Lake of Souls. So obviously we start off our fourth and final trilogy of books here to wrap up the series, of course. This is also the longest book in the series. It's like 220 pages, so it's like 30-40 pages longer than most of the other books, including like the last book, which is kind of interesting. But that's mainly because it is the most sort of, almost like side story kind of book we've had so far, in that yes, it is continuing on from book 9 into this, and then it sort of sets up book 10 to a degree, but fundamentally this is the only book that covers the whole, going to the Lake of Souls, Darren and Harkat's journey to find out who Harkat is. It's very kind of different than sort of the structure of the other trilogies of novels that make up the 12-book series. Rereading it again, and that I didn't remember a few of the key reveals, was kind of interesting. The big one I knew, of course. Harkat is Kurta. I knew that, I remembered that. Great. Once Spitz was introduced, I kind of remembered, like, okay, I know the reveal with him, he's a cannibal, and it actually remembered that, oh yeah, in the Mr. Crapsley prequel novels, I think he's in that as well. Great. The thing I forgot, which was kind of interesting, was actually that where they went to, where they were transported to, was actually the future. That I completely forgot until I basically got to the end of this. And that really sort of changed my mind about sort of how I felt to a degree about going through this book, in that about 100 pages into this, or nearly halfway through, I was kind of surprised at like how for like the first time in the reread I kind of felt like this is a little bit dull. Like it's fun, like Darren and Harkat working together on this journey, but just like the world building of like where we are doesn't feel particularly strong. And again, I didn't really remember that this was actually just future Earth, basically, as a wasteland after the Lord of Shadows sort of comes into power. I completely forgot that. But when I got to the reveal, and a lot of the more interesting stuff in the second half of the book, once they started to tease stuff a little bit more, actually place the pieces there for you, then it began to work a little bit better, and suddenly it made the stuff that happened before feel a little bit better with regards to like, oh, why was like the first main threat just a panther? Like when you get there and don't have any context, it's just kind of like, really, we're potentially like in a new world and we're just dealing with a panther, and then we go to see a giant toad, and it's kind of like, what's going on here? And then you meet the Temple of the Grotesque and the Kushadala people, and it's like, okay, what exactly is going on here? And then you eventually get to the Lake of Souls. But the interesting reveal is that, like, oh, we're on Earth, which would explain why they encounter like a panther sort of out in the middle of basically nowhere. Why animals have like a sort of place of purpose sort of in the world again. Dragons is definitely something that makes you go down the sort of more like we're on a different planet or we're in a different dimension style situation. But I believe there's a reference in one of the upcoming books to why there are dragons on Earth, that, like they say at the end, within the next like 10 to 20 years, basically dragons appear on Earth. Now, that doesn't seem particularly crazy given that this is a universe that has vampires, vampanese, and beings like Ivana, Mr. Tiny, and Mr. Tall, who can like see the future and are basically, magical, godlike in nature. And so dragons existing isn't particularly that much of a problem, but it helps to explain some of like Harkat's nightmares, which was basically him envisioning the future. It's one of the few points at which like a lot of the setup from much earlier before clearly shows you what was going on here. Those nightmares that he was having was sort of in a way like sort of what Kurta was experiencing in the Lake of Souls in the future, as the world, everything goes wrong. The fact that he sort of basically saw dragons in his nightmares, that's what was happening here, basically, was him sort of seeing the journey that he was to go on. and I think that all worked really well. I liked how the reveal ended up coming out with Harkat / Kurta at the end, taking the postcards, which he didn't know what to make of when he first picked them up, and he shows them to Darren at the end, and they're like, these are Earth postcards from specific places, but from years and years into the future from where we are now. This confirms it, because Mr. Tiny and Mr. Tall weren't telling him, where they actually went to here. But that actually, to me, brings everything together. Because, like I said, I found it a little bit dull before I got the reveal. Just that, okay, go after the panther first. You kill it. Okay, they get a little bit of a map from the markings on its body, and then its teeth have letters on it, which initially spell out, Harkat Mold, and then later they realize, oh, it's an anagram, and Harkat Mold, since the introduction of that name, has always been an anagram for Kurta Schmalt. So that's kind of an interesting one, in that you've never been led to kind of believe that you should anagram analyze the characters' names, and especially because basically there were crossover periods where Harkat and Kurta were basically alive at the same time. You would have never ever believed that the person Harkat was before was Kurta, when they were basically both in Vampire Mountain together during book 4, 5, 6. So this is one of the reveals in this series that I think was actually sort of done very well with regards to, yes, it was probably impossible for the reader to necessarily figure it out until basically right before it happened, in that you couldn't, I think, have really predicted it ages and ages ago, like some of the other big reveals. The one thing though is, I suppose, we had this whole book to sort of set up that whole idea of this is who he is. Now we find out that this is who he is. How much of an impact does that actually have? Does having the longest book of the series to build up to that reveal work? And how much actually changes going forward? And this is the thing I don't actually remember too much about book 11 and 12. If Harkat knowing who he is now alters all that much. If I remember correctly, this is sort of more a reveal about sort of mechanics of how sort of the Lake of Souls works, and how little people are made, and how that impacts stuff that will happen later on in the series, rather than necessarily being the greatest character piece for Harkat. But that's me not really remembering the exact details of Harkat's involvement in the last 2 books, so that'll be fun to kind of re-experience again. But the importance of this is obviously that to Mr. Tiny, time is relative, like he says. So to him, whether or not the issues oh, I was alive at the same time as Kurta, doesn't matter to him, because he can transport people to and from different parts of time. That's really interesting. We have a pirate from the 1930s as our other sort of notable character in the book, with Spitz. And I suppose just covering him as a character here briefly, it's a very oddball, kind of random character to introduce them to. It's just this sort of almost madman who just kind of drinks a lot and tells them pirate stories, and kind of helps them along the way because he's been here for longer than them. But again, I think a lot of the stuff in this book, it comes together towards the end when you realize that, oh, he's telling them all these stories, but he's also very vague about specific parts, his exact involvement with the crew, what exactly he did, how he survived certain parts. And so when it eventually comes out, when he gets to the Lake of Souls and is it just snaps, the whole illusion of the person that he is snaps, and he's just I get to fish up people to eat, and he revealed to be a cannibal, that he was the ship cook. But even when they were stranded out at sea, there was always food, and it was because he was, feeding the rest of the crew the people that they ate. So he made other people into cannibals as well. And then I remember specifically that this character is in the Larkin Crapsley prequel books as well, which sort of further establishes it. But that was another good, I think, reveal, sort of betrayal moment of like, Spitz is like truly, truly crazy, and that this is all he really wants from this. That more than the whiskey he finds, that he finds a lot more interest in wanting to eat people again. Definitely a kind of nice sort of horror element to sort of have in the book, was just like, whoa, that's crazy. He obviously tries to turn the table on them by basically pointing out that, like, the people criticizing me for being a cannibal are a vampire who has to drink blood, and Harkat, who can basically eat anything and has in the past, before he sort of gained his sort of sentience, I suppose, as, Harkat slash Kurta, has eaten humans before. But yeah, the big reveal of Harkat being Kurta, actually discussing the details of it is honestly like a big reveal, because Kurta is definitely one of the best characters from, the second trilogy of books, the Vampire Mountain sort of trilogy. And you're kind of like, oh, wow, like they killed off like one of the more interesting characters, this very nuanced character who had this opinion that was somewhere in the middle of like vampires, vampanese on either side. And obviously the idea was more that like Darren learned from Kurta, and so he, as like a new prince, has an opinion that is somewhere in that same ballpark. Maybe not as extreme, maybe he leans more towards the vampires, whereas Kurta obviously lent a little bit more towards the vampanese. But fundamentally there were these key characters, because as was explained, they have already missed an opportunity to defeat the vampanese lord by executing Kurta like they did, but they had to do it. And as we see, Kurta, the reason he hasn't gone on to like paradise like Mr. Crapsley has, is because he's tortured himself almost, and has been tortured by how he felt about betraying the clan, killing Gavner, and all of the things that he did right at the end. And so when we get to the very end of the book and we're left with this situation of like, okay, Harkat, you understand who you are. You are Kurta. The decision is left to Kurta, who they just fished out, because this is the actual body. And it's like, which one of you should be the one to sort of continue on in life? With the idea sort of being that Harkat has sort of earned Kurta an extra shot at life by doing what he did in terms of protecting Darren, to allow Mr. Tiny's plan of having so much fun with the War of Scars to actually take place. Mr. Tiny is offering him this chance at life, but Kurta gives it to Harkat. And I thought that was like a really good moment of sort of a redemption, of just, he could have chosen to take the almost like selfish path here and just like, yeah, I'll be alive again, I'll be able to do what I need to do. But no, he acknowledges that Harkat is the one who's been involved in this. He deserves to live. Because they are still like different people. It's an interesting kind of point of like, when they choose one or the other, how much of each of them do they remember or forget? In that Harkat ultimately made a little bit more sense, as that like he, by being the Kurta going forward, gains the memories of basically who he was as Kurta. But it would have been interesting, like, would Kurta have gained all of the memories of being Harkat? I'm not sure, but it was a nice moment to have this character back, but also acknowledge that now Harkat is Kurta. And that's very complicated for the characters to have to deal with. But Harkat has been such an ally to the vampires. And it helps to add like a lot to, this is his significance in the War of Scars. That they were only allowed to bring 3 vampires along. But he also, Mr. Tiny pointed out, you can have allies from outside of the vampires. And he kind of was pointing out basically that Harkat is going to be like surprisingly important if he chooses to help you. And this is wise, because Harkat is Kurta. Kurta can play an important role in things. Yes, they missed an opportunity by killing him at that point in time. But Harkat through his own actions, has allowed this whole sequence to actually happen in the first place. Because Mr. Tiny all but states that if not for Harkat doing what he did and helping Darren, saving him at specific points of the story, that the vampires even having a chance to win would never have even happened. And it just speaks to, this is the book that I think more than any of them fully clarifies Mr. Tiny's position as a meddler, just trying to gain as much entertainment as possible out of manipulating the pieces on his grand board. It's moments like when they arrive at the kitchen, the modern kitchen, the big proof of like that they were in the future. And Mr. Tiny has left them a note that is so specific of like he knows that they'll either fail before this, or if they turn up here, this is what will have just happened. And it's completely correct. But he constantly says at key moments that I didn't know exactly what way this would turn out. I knew that a conflict would happen here, but the result of that conflict could have gone either way. That in his mind, in his vision of the future, like it leans in one way more than the other, but there's still the chance for the other way to happen. And that's sort of been the whole kind of point of this, of like, we're now seeing everything has sort of been manipulated by him, and it's all going to come, I guess now, given that it's confirmed right at the start of this book, 3 of the chances are gone. They've got 1 chance left to win. That last opportunity, is it leaning in one way or the other, or is this truly 50-50? He has no clue which exact way it will go. That's the big one going forward. Of like, now Darren especially has this incredible like view of this is what will happen if a Lord of Shadows kind of comes into being. And again, you have to remember that the idea is that it's not just that the Vampirese Lord will cause this. The idea is, even if the vampires win, Darren is sort of destined to become the Lord of Shadows if he defeats Steve. He will cause that future just as much as Steve will, even though it doesn't seem like he was even capable of that. So either way, it seems like Mr. Tiny is going to sort of get what he wants, and that's going to be a key part of this, of like, can they break out of this sort of entertainment cycle that Mr. Tiny has sort of locked them into? Is there any way to avoid just this set path of Steve or Darren? Either way, there's going to be a Lord of the Shadows. That's the big kind of question going forward. And now, okay, Harkat having succeeded at getting back his memories, realizing who he is he now going to play an even bigger role going forward? There is actually quite a lot that happens right at the start of the book as well. The obvious one is Darren dealing with the death of Mr. Crapsley, because it obviously happened right at the end, and there was the whole need to escape and have the big reveal of like Mr. Crapsley died without actually having defeated the Lord of the Vampirese. But when they get out and like they decide like, okay, here's what's going to happen. Vanch is going to go back and alert everyone to what happened. We're going to go to Cirque du Freak. And we get back and it's just Darren in this completely sort of depressed state where he kind of feels that like, okay, I understand what he said, of like not to just go on this quest for vengeance that will destroy me all the more. But also, he hasn't fully dealt with the death of Mr. Crapsley. He hasn't cried yet about it or anything like that. So he's in this very depressed state for so much of his time back. And, he has fun interacting with Evra's kids and stuff like that. But he hasn't really dealt with it yet. So that scene with Truska is really, really important in terms of just the way she talks to him and helps him through it. And you get that section of the story where you just have Darren dealing with losing someone so close to him. That was, I think, really, really well done. An excellent use of Truska as a character, and just the dynamic she has with him. Even though they've only had, like, maybe across the entire series up to now, like 3-4 scenes together, there's a sort of emotional bond between those two, which I do quite like. So that's kind of good. And then like Ivana kind of comes back into it. She's kind of utilized, like, I suppose twice in this book, right at the start, and then she has a role to play while they're, you know, in the future, basically. And I like this in terms of just she overall can play a role in the like War of Scars. She can't really choose a side or anything like that, but while the battle is sort of on hiatus, which is what like Mr. Tiny sort of points out, like Steve has gone to plan anew. His giant plan over the course of the last trilogy has been executed. He has to have time to come up with the next one. So there is now a break in the war before the next battle actually happens, before the next encounter happens, which is why we can have a sort of side plot like this. Time to actually go after the finding out who Harkat is, and she's now able to interact with them and realize that, you know, she was close with Mr. Crapsley too. She had to deal with his death. It's just that she dealt with it many years ago when she sensed in the future when he would die. And it's just this very interesting perspective of just these other forms of being who can see the future, of like Ivana, Mr. Tall, and Mr. Tiny all just are like this. And that was what was so interesting again about right at the end they come out and there's Mr. Tall waiting for them right there, and he is just as wise about this stuff as the other two. So lots of interesting stuff to consider. We have Alice and Debbie go to Vampire Mountain to try and ask the vampires to basically be the vampire version of kind of Vampets, or to at least have like a counter to the Vampets, that the Vampanese and vampires themselves won't use like ranged weaponry, but the Vampanese are using Vampets as like human allies to have that advantage. And so this is the counterpoint to that. And I like that, you know, that's a kind of important role for them, of like, when we get the answer to that question, it's going to be very key in terms of how serious of a threat, how much of a willingness there is in the middle of all of this to, you know, kind of in a way break a key rule there, even though it is just letting humans interact. Again, I think you saw the idea of like Debbie and Darren's relationship, if not for the situation happening, could have happened, but just him coming right off the death of Mr. Crapsley and not being able to deal with it at that exact point, and now we're building up to the final encounter. The timing just is not right for that, but you know, we have to wait and see what happens in book 11 and book 12 still. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover here. I suppose dragons, I suppose, is kind of an interesting one. It's obviously been set up a little bit before with Harkat's dreams, but actually seeing them in action here, I don't think there's too much necessarily to say about it. Like, it's a cool reveal that, oh, like there are dragons out there, and it kind of makes sense with like godlike beings, vampires, oh, dragons as well. I didn't think there was anything like particularly special about their exact portrayal here. They were obviously massive threats, fire-breathing dragons. There was like only a few of them. There was the spell that kept them out of the Lake of Souls, which was broken when Spitz fell in. But, you know, that's kind of really all there is. But it speaks to just this idea of like, you know, where did dragons come from? And that, like, if that's only like 20 years into the future, that means that at some point very soon, up and coming, dragons come into existence. How did that happen? But we'll see, I suppose, with that in the upcoming books as well. So yeah, an interesting book. Probably not my favorite one overall. Again, even though the reveals make it better, I still felt like the first half was a little bit kind of not the most exciting thing, and that just is probably just a factor of not wanting to overly heavily world build where they were, given that it was meant to be a big reveal right towards the end of the book that, oh, you've just gone to the future, you haven't gone to a different planet, you've just gone to the future. And if he was overly detailed early on, you might have been able to figure that out too early. So I sort of actually appreciate the caution here. When the whole Steve is Lord of the Vampaneze reveal was so obvious, I actually appreciate holding back on quite a few reveals with this book and it being a surprise and a shock. But like I said, I'm very interested to see coming off this again. I don't really remember the exact role or extra importance of Harkat going forward now that he realizes he is Kurda. The one change we saw immediately was that he straight away called Mr. Tall Hibernus, acknowledging the fact that Kurda always called him Hibernus by his first name rather than just Mr. Tall. So my guess is that Harkat's just going to be more knowledgeable now, because he's gone from being like alive for a set amount of time to now he sort of has the wisdom of being like a 100-plus-year-old vampire as well. But they're my thoughts on Book 10 of Darren Shan, and next week we'll move on to Book 11, Lord of Shadows. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.